Thank you.
Thank you. All right, everybody, if we could take our seats, we'll begin the next panel. By way of introduction, I'm John Malcolm. I'm the Vice President of the Institute for Constitutional Government, also Director of the Mies Center, and because the Gilbertsons are here, I'm also the Gilbertson Senior Legal Fellow here at Heritage. And we're here today to talk about voter integrity. And I want to begin, actually, by reading something hot off the presses from today's headlines out of Texas. Edinburgh Mayor Richard Molina has been arrested for voter fraud, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton announced Thursday morning, the latest in a string of arrests the state's election fraud unit has made in connection with what Paxton described as, quote, an organized illegal voting scheme in the November 2017 municipal election that brought Molina to power. According to a news release from the Attorney General's office, Molina directed voters to change their addresses to places where they did not live, including an apartment complex owned by Molina, so they could vote for him. Molina, hailed as an anti-establishment outsider, won the election by 1,240 votes, unseating incumbent Mayor Richard Garcia in the South Texas town. Look, it is no surprise that we are a closely divided country and are likely to remain so for quite some time. And how we conduct our elections is one of the issues that divides us the most. And it has repercussions, of course, for every area of public policy. So the right to vote in a free and fair election is a basic civil right. And Congress and the state should do everything that they can in order to be sure, in order to be sure that it is easy for eligible voters to vote, and it is difficult for fraudsters to steal or dilute those votes through their fraudulent activities. In a speech last week at Yale University, Stacey Abrams, who narrowly lost the Georgia gubernatorial race and who is considered to be a rising star in Democratic circles. She's the person who delivered the response to the last State of the Union. She said that voter fraud is not a serious problem, but that voter suppression of minority voters is. She stated, and I quote, "There never was a rash of voter fraud. We can't get 50% of Americans to do anything." This is, of course, a complete red herring. In order to steal an election in this country, you don't need to fabricate anything like a majority of votes. Given how closely divided we are in many jurisdictions, it only takes a few votes in order to throw the outcome of an election. Election fraud is quite real, and nobody really knows the extent of the problem because they don't want to look for it. The integrity of our elections are at risk, and the stakes are extremely high. We have three experts with us here today to discuss this topic, and I will be keeping their introductions short so that you can hear more from them and less from me. First, we're going to hear from Christian Adams. Christian is the president and general counsel of the Public Interest Legal Foundation, a public interest law firm that is devoted entirely to litigating election integrity issues. A graduate of the University of South Carolina School of Law, Christian served in the voting section of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice from 2005 to 2010. Prior to that, he was general counsel to the South Carolina Secretary of State. He's a frequent commentator on political matters. He's the legal editor of PJ Media, and he is the author of Injustice, Exposing the Racial Agenda of the Obama Justice Department. In 2017, both he and Hans von Spakovsky, whom I'll introduce in a moment, were appointed by President Trump to serve on the short-lived President's Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. After Christian, we will hear from my colleague Hans von Spakovsky, who is a senior legal fellow in the Mies Center along with me. He is also the manager of our Election Law Reform Initiative. A graduate of Vanderbilt Law School, Hans has served in a number of important positions related to the issues we are here to discuss today. In addition to having served on the President's Advisory Commission, as I previously mentioned, Hans served on the Board of Advisors of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. He was a member of the Board of Registrations and Elections for Fulton County, Georgia, and a vice chairman of the Fairfax County, Virginia Electoral Board. Like Christian, Hahn spent a number of years in the Justice Department as a counsel to the head of the Civil Rights Division, and for 2 years, Hahn served as a member of the Federal Election Commission, the body which is charged with enforcing our campaign finance laws in federal elections. He is also a frequent commentator and the author of 2 books, along with his co-author John Fund, including Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk. And then finally, we will hear from Fred Whitaker. A graduate of Loyola Marymount University School of Law, Fred is the managing partner at Cummins & White LLP, where he began his legal career. In 1993, Fred left Cummins & White for a brief time to take up the position as vice president and general counsel at SC Fuels of Orange, California, and he eventually rose to the position of chief operating officer of their Northwest Division before returning to Cummins & White in 2000. He has a lot of experience in political circles. He served for a number of years on the Orange City Council and also served as the mayor pro tempore of the city of Orange. And in 2010, he was unanimously elected as the chairman of the Republican Party of Orange County, where he was recently re-elected. And with that, Christian, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you so much, John, for that introduction. I appreciate everybody's time and interest in this issue. One of the things I want to start with was a bridge to the last talk, and it's a premise. It's a premise that I think will help you understand all of these issues we're going to talk about today. And the premise is this: the left views election process as the key to their utopian outcomes that they're all seeking. If only they could do certain things, they would reach their nirvana of big government policies that they're after. And you see this most manifest itself in areas in the news lately, such as changing the Electoral College. They don't like the Electoral College because that's what the founders put in place so the states could have representation. Of course, everybody's familiar with voter ID, but I want to try to emphasize that the process fights are much bigger than just voter ID in the Electoral College. They're pervasive across every structure of elections. And I'm going to show you some of those structures today and some pretty fascinating pieces of evidence that we have found. The left is spending hundreds of millions of dollars on process. What do I mean by process? The mechanics of elections, how you register to vote, who gets to vote, when do elections occur, how do you count the votes, how do you draw district lines. They view all these, frankly, boring process issues as the key to achieving the sort of utopian outcome that they're seeking through the democratic mechanisms. Their central premise is if everybody voted in every election, they would have left-wing policies. They view our views as the minority views in the country, so they're always trying to make the system capture every vote. But the more important thing they're doing is cranking in vulnerabilities. The best example of that might be California, where for decades, vulnerabilities have been cranked into the system. I'll give you one example. Under the 2002 Help America Vote Act, California was supposed to implement a statewide database of voters. That way you could tell if somebody was registered in Los Angeles 4 or 5 times, but also in Orange and also in Fresno. Well, California didn't implement that database for 18 years. It took them 18 years to implement it, and meanwhile the rolls became a mess. This is something that our organization, the Public Interest Legal Foundation, has been finding all over the country. What this is an original voter registration form. And it's a little confusing, but we put a helpful arrow there because I want to zero you in on one particular thing. This is not an outlier. We are finding this in our research all over the country. We're finding it in California, we're finding it in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Michigan. Everywhere that we're looking, we're finding this problem of non-citizens getting on the voter rolls. And you might ask, how is it that it happens that non-citizens get on the voter rolls? Well, I'm here to tell you that unfortunately, under existing law, the checkbox you see before you is the only thing stopping non-citizens from getting on the voter rolls. And even when the checkbox exists, and an alien truthfully says, no, I am not a citizen of the United States, they are still getting on the voter rolls, as you can see here from Carlos Gamarra's voter application in the state of New Jersey. Now, this is not an outlier. I don't have time to show you but this one example. I could show you many, many, many examples like this of non-citizens getting on the voter rolls, even after they tell election officials they're not citizens. Now, how does this fit with the left's central premise? They believe that foreign voters have foreign ideas about America. And I think many of you would agree that you're seeing that in places like California where this problem is acute. Now, you might ask, they might get on the voter rolls, but are they actually voting? Well, one of the things that we do when we research this information is we ask for voter registration history of the individuals who get on the rolls improperly. And before you is one example. This is from the county of San Diego, and you could see, and we've redacted Mr. Gonzalez's first name. This is the voter history of one Mr. Gonzalez, who was found to be on the voter rolls illegally here in California. And you could see that Mr. Gonzalez had been on the rolls quite a long time and had participated in quite a number of elections. Another example. Now, what's interesting about this example is how frequently this individual, Mr. Santafiaga, I think, was registered. He wasn't registered just once as a non-citizen. He was registered multiple times. And you could see he has a keen interest in presidential elections in 04, 08, and 12, as well as a lot of primaries. Again, these appear to be anecdotes, but I can tell you, I could show you hundreds of examples like this across the country. Now, one of the things we're finding when we do our research, and by the way, we have had to sue states because they won't give us this information. We're currently in court against the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has had an acute problem going back decades with their PennDOT motor voter system. The PennDOT motor voter system was not even checking to see if people were aliens before they were registered to vote. Here's an example from some documents we obtained through Allegheny County in Pennsylvania. And this is an example of how these people are coming to the process. They went to PennDOT, they made me fill up applications for voter registration. I thought it was as any other paper needed to be filled up in order to get my license. This is at the motor voter stage. Next one. Now, this is interesting. This, I believe, is from California. This individual was registered to vote and accidentally thought that they were registering for a student body president election. And it gives you an example of how broken the system is. Again, I could show you hundreds of examples like this today. Unfortunately, we only have time for a few. So I guess I want to close by saying process matters to the left. They want to achieve their policies through changing the process and cranking in vulnerabilities. Thank you.
Well, welcome to California. I'm Hans von Spakovsky, and I've been working on this issue for a long time. In fact, I have to say one of the best things I ever did at the Justice Department was hire Christian Adams to work there for a while. The National Commission on Federal Election Reform, you may recall that after the 2000 election, it was headed by Jimmy Carter and by James Baker, former Secretary of State. And it was very interesting because, you know, Jimmy Carter's a Democrat. You'd think he would deny voter fraud, but a lot of people forget he actually had to go to court when he first got elected to the legislature in Georgia because the local machine basically stole his election. So he's a big believer in voter fraud. But this is the most important thing that they said about it. The left tries to say, oh gosh, you know, we have so little voter fraud if they even admit that any of it exists, and you know, hundreds of millions of people vote. Yeah, but we have elections decided by a small handful of votes all the time in this country, across the nation, particularly at the local, county, city level, and frankly, congressional races like the 9th congressional race in North Carolina, which was decided by only about 900 votes in the last election. And that's why, as Christian has said, every fraudulent registration, stolen vote makes a difference. Now, John Malcolm and I, we got so tired of hearing the Washington Post, New York Times say, there's no voter fraud in the United States, that about 3 years ago, we started a database. Now, this is not a comprehensive database. We don't have the resources to go through and research every single county in the country, all their court records and everything else. We just started collecting information on this. By the way, a lot of local convictions aren't even reported in a way that you can find them. And we were very strict with this database. We knew it would be examined in great detail by the left. So the only cases we have in here are where individuals actually be convicted in a court of law of committing election fraud, or a judge has ordered a new election because of fraud, or a state agency like the North Carolina Board of Elections has found that fraud occurred in the election. We're up to almost 1,200 cases from across the country. And some of these are cases where one person committed fraud, like a guy who we have in there who voted in 3 different states and got caught doing it. But we have other cases that involved hundreds, if not thousands, of fraudulent ballots. And this is just a fraction, the tip of the iceberg of the problem. Now, just to give you a quick example of how the research is done and what's not done about it is the Government Accountability Institute did a very interesting project a couple years ago. In 2016, they got the voter registration lists and voter histories from 21 states. Now, these are only about 17% of the registered voters in the country, and they supplemented the voter registration data, which is often not very complete, with commercial data. So they were able to get the full Social Security numbers of people who were registered to vote. In the 2016 election, when Donald Trump was elected, they found at least 8,500 people who had voted in more than one state illegally in the 21 states they were looking at. And they matched people down to first name, last name, birth date, and full Social Security number. They estimated that if they had applied to this whole country, there were probably at least 45,000 people across the country who illegally voted in more than one state. Now, they had the names of all these people, the 8,500 folks that they found. Do you think that a single election official in any of those 21 states or law enforcement officials called them and asked for the names of those individuals so they could be prosecuted? No, not a single one. So none of those cases are going to end up in our database of 1,200 voter fraud cases, but there's a potential another 8,500 cases. By the way, 2,200 of those voters were in the state of Florida. 2,200 voters, what, was that 4 times the margin of victory of George Bush in 2000? And by the way, they found 15,000 voters registered at everything from basketball courts to vacant lots. So that gives you an idea of the extent of the problem. Now, the election reforms we need are government-issued photo ID requirements to vote both in person and absentee. You, of course, don't have that in Florida. In California, don't have it in New York either. Proof of citizenship requirements when you register to vote. Because the non-citizen problem that Christian has told you about is a big problem all across the country. If I had more time, I could give you all kinds of stories about how there are potential elections that may have been changed by that. Just something as simple as using jury forms to find non-citizens, because all of you who've been called for jury duty, you are asked, are you a U.S. citizen, because you have to be one to be on a jury. And all of the courts have lots of information about people who were called from the voter registration list for jury duty, were excused because they swore under oath, I am not a U.S. citizen. What do you think is done with that data in most states? Absolutely nothing. In fact, Terry McAuliffe, former head of the DNC, big friend of Hillary Clinton, who was the governor of Virginia, when the Republican legislature passed a bill that would just do something very simple, it said jury commissioners had to forward that information to local county election officials, he vetoed the bill. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that the left wants non-citizens to be able to register to vote and to get away with it, even though it's highly illegal. We need more comparison with state databases, and we need states to compare their voter registration lists, for example, with the Department of Homeland Security's database on aliens to find aliens, and we need all kinds of other things like regular cleanups of voter rolls, which the left constantly opposes. They don't want voter rolls cleaned up. They don't want people who are ineligible taken off. And the other thing that we need is more states to be part of what's called the Interstate Cross-Check Program. Look, right now, it's very easy for you to register in more than one state, and your chances of getting caught doing that are pretty nil. So if you want to vote twice, I'm not encouraging you to do it, but it's pretty easy to do and you won't get caught. There is a program out there started by Kansas. 28 states are in it, where they try to compare their state voter registration lists once a year. And you know what the left is doing? They're suing those states, saying they shouldn't be in that program because it's a violation of the Constitution for them to do that. The amount of money being poured by the left into this is, they're out-resourcing us to an extent you just can't believe. They even have something called the State Infrastructure Fund, which all it does is raise money, at least $60 million from all those foundations you see listed on the left, and that money is funneled to, you see all the organizations on the right. Christian's organization, Public Interest Legal Foundation, is one of the only organizations out there, along with Heritage, fighting this, and look how many other organizations we have against us on this issue. All of these are the reforms, so-called reforms, being pushed by liberals, which are going to make things worse. Automatic voter registration, California is one of the states that put that in. For those of you who don't know what it is, you know how right now if you go to DMV, they ask you, would you like to register to vote? Well, in automatic voter registration states, they don't ask you. You are automatically registered. And the thing is, the left doesn't want you just registered from DMV. They want you registered from public assistance offices, people who apply for welfare. They want you registered from other state databases. And of course, what's that's going to do? It's going to register people who are not U.S. citizens. It's going to register people multiple times who, for example, have a driver's license and, for example, apply for welfare. It is a recipe for increasing fraud, and it's a real problem. Same-day voter registration, about a dozen states have that now. And that's something else they want, because in same-day registration states, you register and can immediately vote. And if there's a problem, if there's a...
Slides for each one of these.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I forgot, I was talking. Yeah, that's the automatic voter registration. Yeah, same-day registration. Same-day registration, like I said, you can register and vote election day. Well, what does that mean? It means election officials have no opportunity to verify the accuracy of the information you're giving them. And I give you a good example of this. New Hampshire has same-day registration. A couple years ago, to great opposition, they actually passed an ID law. In the 2016 election, 6,500 individuals used an out-of-state driver's license to register and vote. Now, you can do that if you've moved to the state and you haven't had time to get a New Hampshire driver's license. But a year later, only 1,000 of them had gotten a New Hampshire driver's license. And the numbers in New Hampshire were that Hillary Clinton only won the state by 3,000 votes. And Kelly Ayotte, the incumbent Republican senator, lost by 1,000 votes. So how many of those 5,500 individuals were folks who just drove across the line from Massachusetts, Vermont, and surrounding states because they knew they could register, vote, and go back home? We don't know. All-mail voting, this is the big thing being pushed by the left. Oregon has it, Washington has it, Colorado. Terrible idea, because absentee ballots are the tool of choice of people who want to steal elections. I mean, they are easy to get, they're easy to forge, they're easy to manipulate, it's easy to intimidate voters because there's no election officials overseeing any of it, and it can cause a real problem, and it increases the vulnerability of elections. I'm not going to talk a lot about vote harvesting. I think Fred is going to talk about that. I will just simply tell you what it means. In many states like North Carolina, the only way your absentee ballot can get back to election officials is you can mail it, you can deliver it, or a member of your family can deliver it. That used to be the law, I think, in California. They changed the law so that anybody can deliver your absentee ballot. And what does that mean? It puts your absentee ballot in the hands of what? People working for campaigns, party activists, and others who have a stake in the election. The North Carolina 9th District congressional race was just overturned because one of the consultants hired was picking up absentee ballots, for example, that hadn't been completed and hadn't been voted yet by the voter, and so he filled it out for them and turned it in. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, that's the North Carolina race. Oh, and U.S. v. Ike Brown, I should mention this is a case that the Justice Department prosecuted. It started with me, and then Christian actually took it over and tried the case, and they had testimony in court of Democratic Party activists going into people's homes and telling them, here's how you need to vote this ballot, or filling it out for them, and that's what happens when you allow vote harvesting. Felon voting, as you know, is a big thing being pushed by the left. All the presidential candidates right now are pushing it. That is a right of the states to decide. States can decide whether felons lose their right to vote, and when they do, 2 states do not. Maine and Vermont allow you to vote from prison. As you know, Bernie Sanders thinks that's a good idea. The left wants automatic voter, automatic felon reenfranchisement the moment they get out of prison. Now look, I don't have a problem with states eventually returning the right of felons to vote, but doing it right the moment they get out of prison means that you're saying they're going to do it when they haven't finished their parole, they haven't finished their probation, they haven't paid any restitution ordered to their victims. And in states like Virginia, which used to have, and Florida, which used to have a waiting period, having a waiting period is a good idea. Why? Most felons are back in jail within 5 years, 75%. So having a waiting period to show that they really have turned over a new leaf is a good idea. And you can tell liberals aren't really interested in what they always say, which is recommitting them into the community. Because if they did, then they would also not just want to give them their right to vote back, but all the other rights they lose, like their right to own a gun, their right to serve on a jury, their right to have a professional license like a lawyer, and you never hear the left talking about that. The reason this has become such a big push by the left within the last decade, I will tell you, is because of a academic paper that circulated around Washington when Christian and I first got to DC, in which some liberal professors said, well, what would have happened in past close races for Congress if felons had been able to vote the way they want to vote now? There were all these very close races that Republicans won that Democrats would have won, including Mitch McConnell's first race in Kentucky. They want to legalize alien voting, as you know. They don't want non-citizens only voting even while it's still illegal. They want that, but they also want to legalize that. About a dozen towns and cities do that. San Francisco is now the biggest. They did it just a couple of years ago by referendum. I'll end with this, the National Popular Vote Plan. This is a plan to get rid of the Electoral College without really getting rid of it through a constitutional amendment. An organization called NPV, founded in California, I hate to say, has been going to state legislatures and saying, we want you to pass this bill as part of a state compact in which you agree that once enough states have passed it that represent 270 electoral college votes, which is what you need to become president, you will agree that from then on you will award your electoral college votes for your state not to the candidate who won your state, but to whoever won the national popular vote. There are 15 states that have passed this, the most recent being Colorado. You can see they're about 2/3 of the way towards getting what they want. It's been mostly blue states, as you can see, but they are hiring Republican lobbyists in other states now trying to convince red states and purple states to pass this, so this is a big danger. I don't think I have to argue to you all why the Electoral College is a good idea. The whole reason it was put in, and it's just as true today, was because the framers of the Constitution were afraid that if someone was elected by a national popular vote, they would only go to the big cities. They would ignore the rural and more less populated parts of the country. That is just as true today as it was then. All you have to do is look at the map of the 2016 election to see the counties won by the different parties, and you can see that that's true. And there are all kinds of other problems with it. If you got rid of it, it would encourage voter fraud and bring elections much closer than they are. Now I'll pass it over to Fred. Thank you.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be here. My wife and I are President Club members of the Heritage Foundation, and I appreciate being able to be part of this panel. What I'm going to be talking about today is that we experienced everything that these gentlemen have been talking about live and on the ground here in the 2018 election in Orange County, losing 4 House seats, 1 state Senate seat, and 1 Assembly seat in probably the most Republican urban county in the nation, in a county that's long had Republican bona fides, but we were overwhelmed by a green wave. So if you take a look at Election Day ballot drop-off, this is the first indication of that $60 million that was spent by the Democrats in Orange County on the 4 congressional races. 40,000 more Election Day ballots dropped off. That's your absentee ballots they were talking about being dropped off on Election Day. That doesn't count that there was another 75,000 what we call provisional ballots. Provisional ballots are where somebody comes into the polling place the day the election says, I want to vote. And they say, well, you're not on the rolls. Well, then in California, you're given a provisional ballot. You fill out everything. And then after the election, weeks after the election, we're at the registrar of voters. The staff at there is then comparing that person's registration card to what they put on the provisional ballot application the day that they voted a provisional ballot. So roughly, we had 250,000 ballots hit the day of or later in Orange County. Our general election turnout, you think, how could you lose races when it's a Republican county? Well, we have a 2% registration advantage. We turned out 3% more Republicans than Democrats. You think we should win. Let's go to our targeted races. Our targeted races in Congressional 39, we only had a 2% registration advantage. We turned out basically 6% more than the Democrats. We lose that race by 3,000 votes. I can't really see the rest of the slide here from the monitor, so I'll go. Pardon me. In Congressional District 45, this was Mimi Walters' seat. We had a 7% registration advantage there, and we turned out 7% more Republicans than Democrats. We lose Mimi Walters' seat by 11,000 votes. And this is where we'll get into the vote harvesting. 5,300, almost half of that margin, came out of the UCI precincts, and those were almost all same-day registration and voting, where they were bussed exactly right up to the registrar's office. The kids were registered to vote right there and voted that day. Our next slide, let's see. Well, I'm going to go back here. I think I've flipped a. It looks like we may have jumped a slide here. All right, so this is where we had some questionable precincts that we started sampling. So Katie Porter, who is our new congressional delegate from Congressional 45, beat Congresswoman Mimi Walters by 11,000 votes. These are the 2 UCI precincts. In those precincts, she won by 89% of the vote and 94% of the vote. Amazing numbers. Our Senate district that we lost by 3,000 votes, Senator Janet Wynn, Tom Umberg won this precinct by almost 80,000 votes. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing to follow up. When we did a recount in Senate District 34, that was Janet Nguyen, Vietnamese American Republican, highest elected Vietnamese American in the nation, highly ethnic precinct, Vietnamese, Chinese Americans, a lot of Latino Americans. In this particular precinct, this is one of the precincts where we had 80% of the vote go to Tom Mumberg, somebody who looks a lot like me, somebody in their 50s, I think he's a little older, maybe almost 60, Anglo, and yet he wins 80% of a Latino and Asian precinct. One of the things you can do in a recount, and we didn't think that we were actually going to change the numbers and get that from 3,000 votes back, but you're allowed to actually investigate all the votes. And we went through the provisional votes and the absentee votes, and we took down that information, and then we hired canvassers to go back out into those precincts and do canvassing. What we found of the 615 voters that we contacted, 9% had moved, 1%, a little less than 1%, said they didn't actually vote. That was 7. None of them had passed away. 1% said that they had their ballots harvested. So they actually did show up to the polls, or they actually turned them in themselves. Most interesting thing is 22% of these in this precinct that went 80% for one person. Motor voter registration, 22%. 8% were in voter registration, in-person voter registration. 6% were registered online. 3% were election day voter registration. And 28% couldn't recall. To me, what this says, especially when you go back here very quickly, to the 9% that moved and the little less than 1% that said they didn't vote, that's a significant statistical number. So if you take a look at these precincts where we lose by massive amounts, whether it's UCI, whether it's in these neighborhoods where they did a lot of this, what I would say would be get out the vote on steroids, making sure that everybody's got their absentee ballot application and that they're turning their absentee ballots back in. There is definitely that risk of fraud, and fraud that we see happening. Now, these statistics, we're doing more verification on these numbers before we publish them. Then we're going to publish them on a website, and we're going to give them to a nonprofit that's aligned with us called the Institute for Fair Elections. That Institute for Fair Elections has already filed a lawsuit against the Orange County Clerk of the Courts to have the jury summons information released so that it can be compared against the voter registration information. That case is ongoing. It was moved to San Bernardino County because of the venue issues. But if we can get this type of information into these pieces of litigation to hold our registrars and our Secretary of States accountable, it's a little bit of a shot over the bow at the Democrats. Interestingly, we just had a special election here in Orange County in March. That special election for supervisor was almost a direct overlap of Congressional District 45. We had 5 Republicans running, they had 1 Democrat running. They didn't spend the $60 million. I think they spent $600,000. We spent $480,000. We won that by 5%, and if you counted all the other Republicans who were running, we won it by something like 15%. What does that tell you? If they have the untold amounts of money to run these programs, to run up the scores in a few precincts, we lose. If you're running on a traditional election where we have traditional ground game, where we think we're doing the right thing and we get our voters out to vote, we can still win. So this is where voter fraud, and it gets back to exactly what everybody else has been saying up here, it's the small amounts in elections that are close, in precincts that they get intense turnout for one or two, for one person.